as this is 9 o'clock in the morning here, and many people are at work, but want to hear this interview because we have known you, Joy. We met you in Advent when we got your book and shared it, and we, to varying degrees, read it. I will not quiz anyone on the book contents. This is not a class or anything like that, but I'm thankful that we had your book at a very critical time in the life of our little church plant here, when we were going into the Advent season with a lot of uncertainty about our future as a community, and the answers to our prayers were happening during that time for our sustainability here in Pflugerville. And so it was neat that your book happened at that time. I want to start with just a little prayer for this morning. We normally do morning prayer, the whole shebang, but today we'll start with a prayer from the prayer book for the renewal of life, and then we'll get right into it. So thank you all for joining us here today. If you don't want to be on YouTube, I invite you to turn off your camera. And if you don't want your name on YouTube, I invite you to change your name, and you can do that if you'd like more privacy that way. But this will be on our YouTube channel, and I will try to spotlight the speaker so that either myself or Joy will be on the spotlight, and not everybody's faces will be on the YouTube. All right. We'll start with a prayer. The Lord be with you, and also with you. Let us pray. O God, the King eternal, whose light divides the day from the night and turns the shadow of death into the morning, drive far from us all wrong desires, incline our hearts to keep your law, and guide our feet into the way of peace, that having done your will with cheerfulness during the day, we may, when night comes, rejoice to give you thanks through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. So my first question to you, Joy, is what is happiness? And I reread the chapter in your book where you address the horrific videos that came out during the ISIS and ISIL media campaigns and that horrific events. And your chapter that talks about how to be happy when that kind of stuff is happening in the world, and the feeling of threat is very real in a very visceral way. I want to ask you that question. What is happiness, and how can you help us understand that today?
Can everybody hear me okay? Am I good? So I think in some ways, despite having written a book about that, it is a question that I continue to ask and think about, because I think that our world, both in culture more generally and in our churches, kind of have different ways of thinking about that. And I think growing up, I was surrounded by this kind of general idea that there was this really distinct difference between joy and happiness, and I didn't know what exactly the difference was, but joy didn't seem to be something that was lighthearted or full, or it seemed like it was this kind of very serious thing that we had while we were suffering. And which then made me think that if there's these two things, and one is temporary, the other one's more eternal, that actually, having this very somber, serious joy that was somehow related to, but not happiness, was important. And then when you experience, when you live a little bit of life, or you just read the news and you see these terribly difficult things happening, part of the question is not only how can you be happy, but should you be happy? There's this feeling of, if the world is so full of heaviness and pain and real suffering, is it actually good or loving to cultivate happiness? And I think that where I take my my understanding of happiness is actually from the Gospels. So in Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus says, blessed are those who are poor in spirit, blessed are, he goes through all these lists of different people that are blessed. And it's supposed to kind of totally change our perspective, right? Because the people who he says are blessed don't really seem to be blessed in any way that we might think of being blessed, right? They're poor, they're mourning, they're hungry for righteousness and justice, which means that they haven't experienced it yet. So it's people who are frustrated by the lack of justice and righteousness. And something that really changed me was realizing that that word of blessed, literally in the Greek, just means, it means happy. And it doesn't mean happy in some kind of spiritual way. It means like lucky, fortunate, happy, cheerful, as you were saying. And something that further led me to realize is that there's not actually a difference between joy and happiness in scripture. That's kind of some kind of weird Puritan thing that got made up somewhere along the way. And so when I pressed into this question of, okay, if Jesus, who I follow, says that you can be happy while you're mourning, while you're hungering and being for righteousness, while you're poor in spirit, then there must be some kind of happiness that can persist beneath the weight of life and sorrow and suffering. And indeed can be something that that is kind of a response to it. That's something that's more lasting and more fundamental than the injustice we experience. And I think also out of personal experience, I began to realize that the people I knew who were the most loving, the most gentle, the most deep, were often people who had deeply experienced suffering and difficulty, but also had found some kind of foundation of joy. And so that's a very long non-answer, but I think happiness is whatever it is Jesus says when he says, blessed are those who mourn and poor in spirit. And that is a happiness that can persist in and respond to the great suffering we see in the world. And it's something that I want to experience and I want to live.
Thank you for saying that. I do think that whatever definition of happiness we have when it comes to the Christian life, it has to be able to hold up somewhat in times of times like this, and in times that every Christian has had to deal with, which has always been, as you say in your book, the end of the world is always happening. Can you maybe say something about how you experienced the end of the world today, or how you have experienced that? Just for those that have read the book and those that haven't, maybe introduce it that way as well. Thank you.
So the book is kind of structured around these 10 chapters that all have kind of verbs, and one of them was to expect the end of the world. And I get that line from a Wendell Berry poem called The Mad Farmers Liberation Front. But I got it from the experience of, what you mentioned at the very beginning of kind of those terrorizing videos that were a part of the kind of early ISIS campaign a few years ago. Those all started coming out just as I was a senior in college and I was going for a year abroad. And it was funny because it didn't really have anything to do with where I was going. I was going to the UK, but it just kind of introduced this level of fear and anxiety and just a sense of the world is so fragile. And so, kind of anything can happen. And when I think about that, I think about how much more global the experience of COVID has been, when none of us knew what was going to happen or how long things were going to be closed, when we were going to see people who were going to become really ill, and many people we know did. And that first experience for me led me to be like, well, how do you live when you feel like everything just might fall apart? And of course, when you feel like the world as you know it might just end. And in the midst of that experience, I was studying in the UK and to visit Dublin with a friend, and it was a comically bad trip trying to get there. We got tickets at different airports somehow. We didn't realize that nobody that nothing functions after midnight in the UK. And so we had to like find a cab from in front of a nightclub at 3 a.m. And anyway, it was comically bad getting there. But while we were there, we went and visited and saw this book called, or this kind of manuscript called the Book of Kells. And the Book of Kells it's an illuminated manuscript of the Gospels. So it's the 4 Gospels written out. But what it means to be illuminated is they created these beautiful covers and illustrations on the book itself. And they're gorgeous. They was mostly created in the 9th century, so 1200 years ago. And when you look at them, they're so intricate and they're brilliantly colored. And it was just amazing seeing something that had survived that long. But the thing that made it all the more poignant to me was that that these have been created in a time of deep turmoil when it kind of felt like the world was always ending for that world. So the monks who made it, it was during the time of the Viking raids. And so it was a time when continually the abbey was not only being attacked, but destroyed. So they said that various parts of the abbey were just, I can't remember the exact number, but it was like in 15 years, it was like 17 times it raided and various parts were burned. And at one point, like 15 of the 20 something monks were killed. Like it was a really, it didn't just feel like the end of the world. If your whole life is your monastery, then their world kind of ended continually for about 15 years. And the thing that I found really striking was that it was in the middle of this world-ending experience that they created beautiful things. And to me, what it testified to is the idea that there is something that persists. That the most fundamental thing is not chaos and destruction and unmaking, but that it is the creative and redemptive work of God. And that them doing this beautiful thing in the midst of the world ending was a way of testifying to that. And of course, that is kind of a matter of faith, right? Often it doesn't feel like that's the case. It doesn't feel like, the beautiful and the making and the redeeming is the most fundamental thing. It can feel like death, destruction, and all those things are the most fundamental. But in the midst of that, by responding to the chaos of that era and the violence of that era with creativity, with the preservation of the stories of the Gospels, and by actually not becoming violent. So one of the really interesting things is that as one of my historian friends at St. Andrews for doing my PhD said, they didn't become warrior monks. They just kind of continued to experience this attack, and the way they responded to it was not with violence, but with creativity and with preserving what they thought was being true. And so that's kind of become, it was somehow deeply consoling to me, first of all, to realize that people had felt like it was the end of the world, and that many times since it's felt like the end of the world, and many times since it has kind of practically and functionally been the end of the world for people. It has ended the world that they experienced, they knew. So it's comforting to know other people feel that way, but also that in the midst of that, we have a choice to respond to it with beauty, and that choice relies on this kind of confidence that there might be something that persists beyond the violence and the destruction.
Thank you for saying that. That definitely resonates with me. And I have a number of other questions. I'll ask one last question, and then I want to open it up for anyone else that has a question. But one of the things I loved about this book is that you really offer a vision of basic Christianity, which is something that we as a church are supposed to be teaching. And basic Christianity and Christianity in itself should be able to answer these kind of questions, I think. And I like you open the book with your meditation on your name, Joy, and how that prompts people to sort of assume things about you, and then also you talk about being acquainted with grief and sadness. I thought that was a neat meditation. And can you share a little bit about your name and how that led to the creation of this book? And then I'll open it up for other people's questions. You can type them in the chat or just speak them out loud. I prefer to speak them out loud. That'll help with YouTube and other people hearing your question. think you're on mute again.
There we go. So my name is Joy, or as we would see on the book, Joy Marie. And that name kind of has a story to it, which I feel comfortable sharing because my mom has shared it publicly before. But I have 3 older siblings, and I was, my mom had a miscarriage between me and my other siblings and didn't think she could have any more children. And it almost died the last time that she had been pregnant. And so when she was pregnant with me, she was quite frightened, I think, and didn't know if I would make it or if she would make it. And so she didn't know if I'd be a girl or boy, but her friend would always pray for me. And she would pray for baby Joy, just because that was kind of what she spoke over me. But it was, yeah, so I was born, and that was, I think, how I was received in my family, was this kind of this joy and this joyful thing. And my mom named me Joy Marie for Mary. And she would swear on a Bible that Mary meant consecrated to God. I cannot find any linguistic evidence that is in fact the case. Pretty much everything, if you look it up, it says that it means bitterness or sea of bitterness, or has to do with sea, with salt water, and with which has to kind of do, especially in Hebrew tradition, with tears. And it's similar to, like, if you think of the story of Ruth, when Naomi says, "No longer call me Ruth, but call me Mara." And even Mary herself saying, a sword will pierce your heart, or having that said to her. But that means that my name has this kind of funny contradictory nature. It's joy, sea of sorrow, or sea of bitterness. And I've always really liked that, because I think of it kind of as a fitting contradiction into which I can live, and also a fitting contradiction that the Christian life is, right? It's that we believe there is this fundamental joy and love that God has created us, made us, that creation is very, very good, but also that we live in a world that is broken. And so how do we live the joy that is fundamental to our existence, even in a place where we feel kind of somewhat tossed about in the sea of bitterness? And I tell the story once of, when I was at the university, somebody said, "Well, do you feel like you always have to be happy because your name is Joy?" And the thing I've always found odd about it, also just by some experience, but also by disposition, have always kind of been a more melancholic person, and have often been quite afraid of letting myself live into that, because I kind of had this feeling, which I think a lot of people have, that if you really let yourself be sad about the things that you experience, you might just go on being sad forever. And that was something that I have experienced and struggled with in my life. But one thing that really helped me, and has continued to help me live with sorrow and with happiness, has been the idea of being acquainted with grief. And I take that from it's one of the prophecies about Jesus, when it says that he would, the suffering servant would be a man of sorrow, acquainted with grief. And I always use the phrase acquainted, because it kind of implies like someone who, if you pass them on the street, you would recognize them, but you don't, it's not somebody you want to be like, you don't want sadness to be your best friend, but having this idea that Jesus was acquainted with grief made me wonder if I could also be acquainted with grief and what that would do. And the more that I let myself do that, the more that I realized that grief and sadness are not separate from joy. They're not different. To be happy about something, to really rejoice something good happening in your life, is to recognize that it's a thing of value, that it's something worthwhile, it's something good. Happiness is really a recognition of the true, deep, honest goodness of life. And to grieve is to also recognize value. It's to say, I've lost something, and that thing was worthwhile. It was worthy. It was weighty. It was meaningful. And I'm sad because I'm grieving because I have lost something that was valuable. But both of those reactions are an honest, kind of open reaction to the goodness of the world, whether that's the goodness of the world celebrated or the goodness of the world lost. And I started to realize that when I shut down my capacity to be sad, when I tried to just kind of ignore it or not talk to it when I ignored it when it passed me on the street, when I wouldn't get acquainted with it. I also dulled my own capacity to experience joy and to experience happiness. And so that's something that the book wrestles with and that I thought a lot about, is to kind of to get acquainted with sadness and not be afraid of it, because it really actually has a deep capacity to tell us that things matter to us and that things matter, which is really a testament to the fact that there is goodness in the world. And I think the other thing I would encourage people is that no feeling lasts forever. And even though it feels like they will sometimes, and that we can cause ourselves we can spend a lot of energy trying to not feel feelings, when they're not, they're just our responses to what is in the world. And so the older I get, the more I try to let both the joy and the Marie part of me exist together.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. That's beautiful. I want to open up for questions. If you have a question for Joy Marie today about happiness or about her book or about the subjects she's talked about, I invite those. I'll try to monitor the chat here. Who will be first? I know.
I, of course, will be first.
Awesome.
Hi, Joy. This is Paula. I have to admit, I've only read half the book so far. I'm still working on it. But as far as looking grief in the face and experiencing your sadness and those kinds of things, a lot of us deal with depression. And so maybe later in your book you draw that distinction, but is there somewhere in the book where it talks about how to balance that or not fall into the black hole of that and come out the other side? I've had therapy and I have come out the other side of depression, but do you deal with that in your book at all?
Need to unmute you. Let's see. Oh, Joy, can you unmute, please? Okay,
Yeah. Because I am not a psychologist, I don't want to say anything too prescriptive about that. So my main way of speaking about that is just from my own experience. And I do think there's a difference, I think, between just being sad and being depressed. I think sadness is a normal reaction to difficult things happening. And whereas depression is kind of when it persists with us and when it steals our capacity to feel interested in life and excited. I think two things I would say is that one is the reason I like the idea of being acquainted with grief is that it doesn't mean that grief has to be our best friend or like it has to be our main companion. And for some of us, it has been more of a companion than we wish it had been. And that's maybe just a part of living in a fallen world. But I think that we can sit with sadness every once in a while. We don't have to sit with it all the time, So that's one thing I think about. And I use in that particular chapter, the idea of, if you've read Jane Eyre, kind of the attic wife of sadness, that if you lock sadness away in an attic, it might kind of wreak havoc on your whole life. So you need to let it, but it doesn't have to be your only friend. But I think the other thing I would say is that a lot of dealing with kind of persistent sadness and mental illness for me has just been taking care of myself in other ways. So it's looking after, remembering the fact that I have a body. And so sometimes my inclination is to sit and try to figure out why I'm so sad and what's happening and all the difficult things in my life. And that's, there's an important role for being able to think through those things. But sometimes what I need is not that, it's that I need to eat breakfast, even if I don't feel like it. It's that I need to go out for a walk. it's that I need to take care of myself in some small way. And so in the chapter, remember you have a body. I think that a big part of dealing with our lives well is dealing with our bodies well. And then
I read the chapter about hangry that my family religiously monitors for that. First time somebody is grumpy, we say, "Have you eaten?" So
yeah,
identified for that. But thank you, and I'll keep reading, and I'll let somebody else talk.
thank you for your question. It looks like we have a question in the chat. Shall we
Yes.
look at that one?
Yes. Thank you, EB. Thank you for that.
So EB says, I really loved your story about receiving a foot wash in Mass. How do you receive comfort with grace? I believe a lot of us are more comfortable in offering comfort, but feel shame receiving it. How do we face those feelings with humility? That's a great question. And it's that's kind of the question that I was dealing with in that chapter. So it's maybe worth just retelling part of the story if people haven't read the book. So in the book, I talk about this experience of going to a Maundy Thursday foot washing, and I had grown up in Anglican churches, but not very high Anglican churches, and so I don't think in my memory I had experienced a foot washing before, but I was kind of in a busy flurry, and I was feeling it was right at the beginning of my academic career, so I was feeling very critical of myself and overwhelmed. And then I went to this beautiful foot washing service. I arrived late. My socks were wet because it had been raining. And I was this older priest who's in his 80s, bent down, peeled off my sock, washed my foot, and went all the way down to the ground and kissed my feet. And it was just this really uninvited, unexpected thing that kind of made an impression on me of this is really what Christianity is. It's that when we are not looking for it, when we're not trying particularly hard, when we're not even sure if we want to be in church, God is making these moves towards us. And that's really what it is to be Christian, is to know that we never made the first move. We never did the first thing to make God love us, that God loves, as Romans says, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. God is always the one who's making the first move. And I think how that relates to that great question of how do we accept these things with humility? And that relates to kind of the second half of the chapter, which is there was a particular time in my life when I was just finding it really difficult to be human. And a big part of that was that I think I had a sense of my self-worth being wrapped up in me being useful and loving and responsible, and that I would have several people in my life say, it's okay, you don't need to be those things. We love you no matter what. But I just kind of couldn't accept it. And I realized that being very hard on myself, even though it can feel like it's very humble, because you're like, well, I'm so humble that I don't think very highly of myself. It was actually kind of a weird kind of pride. It was like, God has said that he loves me no matter what I do. People in my life have said me that, but I am the ultimate arbiter, and I think that I don't deserve love. And so for me, it was kind of going back to that moment of having my feet washed over and over again, and realizing that actually the humble thing is to say, God has chosen to love me. And it's prideful actually of me to act like I don't need or deserve that. And similarly, people around us also have chosen to love us, whether that's people in church or our family. And so it's important, I think, to just kind of almost, I kind of had to accept it almost grumpily, like God had just said, gosh darn it, I love you, like get over it, stop fussing so much. So I think it takes a while, and I understand the impulse of not liking it, but I do think that it is a fundamental thing that we must experience. And I think that if we don't experience that grace, then it's often a lot harder to mediate to other people. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think just being as open as you can. If you have if there is an inch in your heart that is open to receiving grace, then put your toe in the door and let God kind of gently open that door. a little bit at a time, and consciously let yourself receive love from other people. Yeah, I hope that begins to answer your question.
That is a wonderful part of the book, and there are so many wonderful parts of this book that I return to again and again, especially the ending of the book. I love how you end this book. I rarely do read book endings. I kind of, once I got the idea, I don't always read the ending, but your book, I've read the ending several times because it's like a sermon to me every day. And when WS has a question, are there certain Psalms you pray for inner calm or heroes from history you derive a renewed push as a role model from? Or so I guess that's a two-part question.
I unmuted myself this time, very proud of myself. Yeah, so the first, when you said, are there certain Psalms you pray for inner calm? A psalm immediately came to my mind, and that is the psalm. I can't actually think of a number, but I memorized the actual psalm, but I can't think of the number. I have composed and quieted my soul like a weaned child. And I think this really gained a greater significance for me when my sister started to have babies, and I watched how, a weaned child's a child that doesn't need to be nursed anymore, but it finds comfort in its mother. So the image that God is painting for us is God as a mother who is embracing us just because she wants to, right? It's this kind of beautiful, in the same way that a child finds safety and comfort and connection in a mother. That's what God is presenting God's self to us as. And so I think meditating on that, and it also makes me think about, so much of the research on attachment and how children, their blood pressure goes down. They're much calmer. They're easier to experience new things when you have that secure attachment with a parent. I think about that when I read this psalm. So go look at the psalm that I composed and quieted my soul like a weaned child against her mother's breast, and read that. I do not concern myself in things too great for me. And just something that's really helpful for me in meditating on the image of God as a mother who's inviting me to rest on her breast like a child would, not out of necessity, but out of affection and love and attachment. So that's something I find deeply consoling and comforting, and that's just kind of one of the central ones in life for me. When it comes to people who have inspired me throughout history, I think one of my favorites is Saint Macrina the Younger. And if you'll, I think I did write a little bit about her in the book, but I would love to write more about her at some point. But she's this really fascinating character from the early church. She's the sister of Basil the Great and Gregory of Nyssa, who were famous for kind of formulating some of the creeds and surrounding the Holy Spirit. But she was their older sister, and she actually educated Gregory of Nyssa. You could say she homeschooled him. And she was this remarkable figure who she started the first monastery. So the Basilian Rite, which is still used in Greek Orthodox churches for their monasteries, was formed through Macrina, because after her father died, they're kind of a wealthy family, and she said to her mom, we're Christians, we shouldn't be having slaves, we shouldn't have servants. So she elevated all the slaves and kind of gave them rooms and property, and treated them like they were the same as her, because they weren't. And then she started using their home as a place to care for the poor, and she would rescue children that had been abandoned. And but she also was this great intellect. So Gregory of Nyssa describes her as a model mother, father, and apostle. And it's not often that you find women described as apostles in that era. So I really love that. And when you see images of her, you can Google it, and she'll either be depicted with a cross and a pin, or she'll be depicted as seated on a little throne surrounded by the Cappadocian fathers, who were these huge important theologians. So she is inspiring to me in her role as a woman who teaches, as a woman who lived counterculturally according to the gospel, that she thought as faith made a difference, and so one should live differently, both in in her use of money and her use of time, and also as a scholar, because I do endeavor to be a scholar. That is my day gig. So St. Macrina is one of my role models, and I am always happy to tell people about her when I get the chance.
Yes, we love her too, for sure. I see that Glenda and then Kristen, but Glenda, go if you can go first, and then Kristen have their hands raised. So Glenda first, and then we'll go to Kristen.
Sorry. I have not read the whole book. I intend to read the whole book, but I just wanted to say that I relate so much to some of the things that you've said in the book and also today. And there was something in the book that related to me that I had never heard before. And that is what you said about your Irish, Scottish heritage and there being a tendency more towards depression with that group. I do have some Irish heritage, and on that side of the family, there does tend to be a line of depression. And so I wanted to share something that I've come across about this, and I'd be interested to hear if you have found anything about that. But this relates to Paula's question also about depression. And that is something that I came across a few years ago, is a book by Julia Ross, who is a psychologist. And she evidently has a lot of medical information that she works with. And in her book, she has a questionnaire that she says that moods can either be true or false, and that people can have false moods. And so they can oftentimes feel depressed, even though there's really nothing to be depressed about. And it's actually a physiological condition that's causing that depression, which kind of makes sense if there's a genetic link to it. And she does say there are many reasons for causing this, that it can be genetics is one, that we kind of come in with a sort of a deficit of these this biochemistry that we need. And she gives different causes and also ways to address it that are natural, like some of the things that you've talked about in care of the body. And she does go beyond that too, that sometimes we actually have a deficit of certain amino acids that affect our brain chemistry. So I just wanted to share that, as it might be a little part of the puzzle too. Because I think if your brain chemistry is off, it's really hard to connect with the spiritual world oftentimes. And that that care in that way is really important also. And just thank you so much for I feel like this is really a ministry that you're doing through your book. So I just wanted to share that it might be helpful. And I am interested to hear anything else that you've heard about the Irish Scottish connection, or if there's anything that's helped you with that.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that all of those things are a part of treating yourself holistically, and remembering that. I think sometimes there can be a danger when you overemphasize the biological aspects of not letting people experience whatever real grief. Sometimes our feelings are because we've had something terrible happen to us, or because we haven't admitted something. And so there's a real role in being able to let those things be real and not try to just, run over those emotions. But on the other hand, there's also a huge weight that's taken off if you realize that maybe sometimes that's just something physical, that maybe it runs in your family, and that it's not just you not trying hard enough or not a good enough Christian. So yes, I think all of those things are worth exploring and thinking about. Someone I would really encourage you to look up, if this is something you're interested in, if you're interested in kind of the connection between faith and mental health and how to think about those things as well, is John Swinton's book, Finding Jesus in the Storm. And I did actually 2 interviews with him for Plow, and he just speaks so helpfully, I think, to this question of taking seriously the experiences of people who have severe mental health troubles, and also taking seriously their faith, their experience and struggles with that. And he does a great job of taking the physiological side of it seriously, as well as the story part of it. So I would check that book out and check his work out. But in general, yes, I affirm taking seriously ourselves as people with bodies and histories, and that needs to be part of how we approach depression and mental health, and not heaping kind of undue guilt on ourselves for just not trying hard enough when it can be physiological.
Yeah, thank you, Glenda. And go ahead, Kristen, if you're still there.
I am. Can you hear me okay? I am on the road, so I'm traveling. I am loving this book. I'm not finished, but your writing is really beautiful, very well written. So there's a part on page 14 where you say, you have a beautiful way of saying, like, you know, there's this big bad thing and it's not mine to tell. But what you say right before that is that you think it dishonors suffering to tell too many people, right? That it dishonors sorrow. And it really struck with me for like way longer than it should have. And I've been flipping it around in my head because I feel like that is a old story I believed a long time ago, that you shouldn't tell too many people about the bad things, whether they're yours or someone else's. And I think I've come to a place now later in life where I've accepted that my greatest sorrows are my greatest assets, that it is by discussing those sorrows and sharing those struggles, the very deep, bad things, where I have a impact with other people, right? Where I share space and empathy. So I was just really struck by that, because it's a beautiful way of saying something that I believed when I was younger, but that I don't know that I believe anymore, right? That it dishonors the sorrow to tell too many people. It's a beautiful phrase. I just really love your writing. You're a very good writer. That's it.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think I hold to it. I totally agree with what you're saying, in the sense of, you know, I think our sorrow and our difficulties and our suffering is, you know, how we can meet each other in real places of empathy and compassion. I'm not against talking about my sorrow if we were having a cup of coffee together, or perhaps a glass of wine. But it's more that I grew up as the child of parents in public ministry. And so I think that sometimes we live in a world where everybody, you know, goes and does these tweet threads about like the worst things that have happened to them. And it lays those things open to strangers on the internet who don't know them, who aren't kind, who aren't compassionate. And I actually do think that that's really damaging to a lot of people. And I know that it would be damaging to me. Like, I know that if I laid out that sorrow, that I don't think, well, I mean, I think there's both the element of privacy for people who haven't agreed for their story to be told. But I also think that there is something about letting there be parts of our lives that are, if not private, then communal. You know, there's a great little bit in an essay that I love about how it's not that our sadnesses need to be private, just me, but that the public doesn't need to know everything about life and every sorrow. So that I feel pretty confident about. I stick to that in the sense that I agree that in safe spaces and with people that we can see face to face, that our sorrow is the foundation of connection and compassion and love. But I think in my own experience, for my own sorrows, and for many other people, I would encourage people actually to, you know, not toss the pearls of your sadness before the swine of the internet. And that's, I think, that comes from for me.
Thank you for that answer. And I like your chapter on how to tell a story, how we tell our stories. I think that kind of fleshes that out in a deeper way, because that is the real question of our internet age is how much do we disclose and how we do it and how that works in community. And even as our little church is asking those questions about how we share our lives with each other, our struggles, our sorrows. It's that is part of it. And I think your chapter on tell yourself a good story is helpful to me and how I do that. And I haven't always done that in a way that has offered greater healing for me or others. So thank you. Susan, yeah.
Yeah, I would like to just add that I had a great sorrow recently, and I was going to, just hold it in. And Father David insisted that I share it with a small group of church. And I've said, I feel like it brought me from the darkness into the light, because so many people were so kind and so loving and responded in a loving way that I'm really thankful that I did that. So yeah, a small group of special people.
Yes, and that's exactly what I mean. I don't mean never tell anyone a sorrow. I mean, tell the people who can hold it and honor it well. And start there. And then if you need to tell it to more people later, then God will lead you to do that.
Thank you. EB has a question about writing nonfiction. How did you piece apart what to share and show of yourself and what to keep for yourself? Because you're fairly general, but still the book was beautiful and personally relatable, specifically in the context of the greater world. I found that to be true as well.
Yeah, the thing is, I wanted to share honestly and openly and authentically, whatever that means, while still letting some parts of my life be, private. And I think I don't know that I had a rule. I just kind of prayed about it, talked to other people, and did what makes sense. I hope that that's not a very helpful answer, but that's generally, I think what I tried to do is to share what was authentic to my experience and my emotion, even if I didn't give all the details, if that makes sense. And that was kind of how I tried to think about it, was how can I be genuine and open with my emotional life while letting some of the details and the people in my life want to be private, stay private, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that is the art of writing and disclosing and sharing. And I think all of us have to, ultimately, that's an answer we have to come up with for ourselves on what that is. But this book helps us do that, I think, in a really profound way. We have time for one last question. If anyone has one more. Thank you all for sharing your questions. Deborah, yeah.
Yes. Well, I know exactly what you mean about sharing your trauma too much or your sadness. And I had a terrible, terrible trauma, the worst of my whole life. And I'm 71 in the past couple of years. And at first, I know I told too many people. And what I felt eventually was a lot of people are not, this is too heavy for them. It was a thing that I never wanted to know about in my whole life. And I've had exposure to stuff and created a great sorrow in me. And it is a sorrow that continues because I just say this much, it involves the abuse of a child that is still going on, which I cannot find the way to help with that. Now, I'm just wondering this, you may not answer this, but I guess this is just a thing you have to develop and pray about. Who can you go to that it will not burden it will not, I always have this feeling sometime now with deep sorrows, I am burdening someone. I didn't want to know about this. I never wanted to know about it. It may be they don't either. Do you know what I mean? And so I just want to say sometimes I don't know how to discern that.
You know, I think the first thing that came to my mind, I mean, yeah, there are some things in this world that I wish none of us had to bear, and they don't ever come to us usually because we ask for them. But I think the first thing that came to my mind is that Christians are called to be a community of people that do bear each other's burdens. And so, yes, sometimes we are burdening someone by telling them about things that have happened to us, but that's okay on some level because it's what Christ asks us to do for each other. You know, there's the passage where it says, bear each other's burdens. And what I was taught about that and what has really helped me is that a few verses before it says, each one of you carry your own weight. And then it says, but bear each other's burdens. So it's this interesting, it's kind of contrasting on the one hand, telling you to carry your own stuff, but then to bear each other's burdens. And the difference there is that the word for burden and weight are different, right? A weight is something that I can carry on my own. But a burden, the burden of the kind of thing you're describing isn't something you can carry on your own. You know, it's something we actually need help with. And a part of being a Christian is being willing to bear the burdens of other people, especially the burdens of each other. And I think that in a weird way, we shouldn't feel guilty about needing other people to help us carry certain things. And I think there's so much weight that can be taken off just sometimes by being able to say something and being able to have somebody else carry it with you. This may sound really silly and obvious, but I think also sometimes it can help. It's helped me to say, what I have to say is really heavy. Can you bear it? You know what I mean? Can you, and obviously no one can know whether they can bear it until you tell them. But I think that saying something like that can help you and the other person know, okay, what I'm about to bring here is something that I need consideration and care and respect with. And can also make you feel like you're not burdening someone without asking. But I think don't feel guilty about that burden. I also think burden's something else I am becoming more passionate about, and I shouldn't somebody up, but I do think that when it comes to abuse, and when we know someone will, you know, we can't slander people, but I think it's okay to talk about these things so they don't just become, they need to be known so that they can be stopped on some level. And so yes, that's my rambling answer is we are people who are called to bear each other's burdens. Not everyone can bear your burden. I think that's what I realize is sometimes you show people something that's a deep sorrow and they dishonor it, and that adds more burden to you. So I think having some wisdom about who you show your burdens to is good, but not feeling guilty because we do need other people to bear our burdens. And then sometimes just telling people, I have a big burden, I need you to bear it with me. So that they have some kind of consent and entering into that bearing that Christ calls us to. I hope that makes some sense, and I'm sorry that you've had to carry that out. I will pray for that today.
That is a wonderful answer that I appreciate so much. I do know when you have terrible things and sadness happen to you, if it is like something you have to carry, and that also makes you be able to carry other people's burdens. I just say to this group, I'm very good at carrying other, you can always come to me, anyone, if you need to, because once you've experienced a great burden, it's like you are stronger at carrying them in some ways with others. Anyway, I love that your answer is very, very wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, Deborah, and thank you so much, Joy. And I've been referring to you as Joy or Joy Marie, but since the writing of this book, you have finished your doctoral work, and you're now Dr. Clarkson. So I want to congratulate you on that, since I met you in the book as a doctoral candidate, as you say, but congratulations on that. And we are blessed by your wisdom and insights today. I want to can I read the last line of your book as we close? It's one I return to a lot. And this is in reference to the final chapter about how the ruins of the cathedral have built many of the houses, that the one that you were living in and many others there. Build your life on a rock and be like the cathedral stones who bless the world long after its body has been broken. Let the world be a place worth rejoicing in because you are in it. There is this odd idea that happy people are shallow. It's nonsensical, really, because true happiness comes from loving other people, and love comes from the deepest well in the universe. Thank you so much, Joy Marie Clarkson, for joining us, and thank you for blessing us with this book, and thank you all for joining in this conversation today.
Thank you so much for having me, David, and thank you for everybody who came and asked such questions.
Thank you
Yes.
so much.
Thank you so much.